Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I hope you are having a great week so far. It's Wednesday, so we're halfway through. Hooray! It's always a nice feeling, if you work traditional Monday through Friday, which not everybody does. So if it's your Wednesday, yay. If it's not your Wednesday, maybe it's your weekend. Also yay. Or whatever day it is. I hope it is lovely. If you joined me on Sunday, then you know that we are doing the lessons for this week of June 3rd, which is the second Sunday after Pentecost. On Sunday's episode, I did the Old Testament lessons, and we have, currently we have 2 Old Testament lessons. Maybe we're making up for skipping them during the season of Easter when we had the Acts lessons. So you've got the, first Old Testament lesson, and then there's an alternate Old Testament lesson, which you can choose if you are the worship coordinator or the pastor at a church, or if you are the person doing a podcast like me, you can just do both of them, which is what I did on Sunday. So 2 Old Testament lessons and the Psalm. Today we'll be turning our attention to the New Testament, so the reading from the epistle and the gospel reading. We're going to go ahead and get started with that reading from the epistle. It comes to us this week from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 5 through 12, and those verses are as follows. For we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be also made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. Again, that's 2 Corinthians 4, 5 through 12. And it's a little clunky to read through. I feel like it is written in a way that shows it is a hymn or poetry or something along those lines because of the way it is written, but it's a little clunky, I feel like. So let's get some context for this particular passage. And actually, we can go ahead and get a little more context for 2 Corinthians as a whole, since we haven't talked about that. 2 Corinthians, according to my study Bible, begins with chapter 1, verse 1, and ends with chapter 13, verse 13. And besides the nice sort of 1:1 and 13:13, that seems kind of obvious. Obviously, it begins with verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, I would assume. But according to the study Bible, many scholars believe that 2 Corinthians was not originally a single letter. They believe that it is a compilation of several separate letters from Paul to the Corinthian church written over a period of time after 1 Corinthians. So you're actually getting several letters in one. We are reading today from the first section, which is 1:1 through 7:15. And in this section, Paul defends his ministry against charges that he is plenty bold when writing letters, but his delivery is weak when he speaks with them face to face. Interesting. His accusers know that he is bold in letters because he wrote a nasty one to the Corinthians, the letter of tears. The anguish that Paul felt about having written that letter and the charges against him drove him to reflect deeply about the meaning of ministry. Interesting. So this first section is a response then maybe to 1 Corinthians, which I think I've mentioned before. My internship supervisor used to call 2 Corinthians Paul's letter to the contentious Christians at Corinth, which is great alliteration, but a bit of a tongue twister. So you've got this first section where Paul seems to be defending himself. And in this day of the internet, we all probably have encountered people who are very bold when they're behind their keyboard, right? It's a lot easier to say things when you're anonymous online than it is to say them face to face. Paul wasn't necessarily anonymous. They knew who he was. He had been there, but they're accusing him of being able to be more bold, maybe be less kind, I'm not sure, in his letters than he is face to face. So now Paul is trying to answer those charges against him. So again, according to my study Bible, chapter 4, which is where we are, verses 1 through 6, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. Here, Paul summarizes the arguments he has made in the earlier parts of this section. He denies the charge of flattery, accuses the super apostles of not understanding the gospel, and presents himself as the community's slave, in contrast to those who would lord it over the church with harsh leadership. So that is right before where we come in. And then chapter 4, verses 7 through 12, this is where we get the treasure in clay jars, and that may be a very familiar image to many of you. The powerful treasure of the gospel is entrusted to human beings who are fragile and breakable like clay jars. Lists of hardship like that in chapter 4, verses 8 through 12, were employed in ancient literature to illustrate the wise man's inner strength, to narrate the wise man's training in virtue, rather on the principle that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and to reveal the wise man's love for humanity. Here, Paul modifies the last theme to show that his ministry is motivated by love. And that's actually further along than what we read. That's in chapter 5, verse 14. So it's his ministry is motivated by love and radical friendship. And then that's in the section 5, chapter 5, verses 18 through chapter 6, verse 10. So that's pretty interesting. 4:15, everything for your sake. In this section, Paul seeks to persuade the Corinthians to set aside the injured feelings his letter of tears caused. So you can see that Paul here is really trying to fix the aftermath of his first letter to the church at Corinth. Which is a good thing to remember. You know, your words have meaning. Your words have power. And in this day and age, again, of the internet and of email, there's no inflection when you type an email or a text. You know, we have emojis now, which sometimes can help, but you can read into a lot in an email or a text because there aren't the clues that you get when you're talking to someone face to face, or even when you're talking to them on the phone. You get inflection, you get face to face, you get facial expressions, etc. So Paul may have thought he was writing something in a particular way when he wrote that first letter, and the people reading it, each person reading it or hearing it, may have taken it in completely different contexts. That is the crazy thing about no inflection, right? About writing something rather than delivering it face to face. It can very easily be misinterpreted. Okay, so we've looked at the study Bible about this part of 2 Corinthians. We're going to look at some commentary also, but first let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be turning to that commentary for our text assigned from 2 Corinthians. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I will be right back.
always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. Jordan and Keith is Entertainment Tonight meets Access Hollywood.
I'm Jordan. The guy laughing, that's Keith.
Yeah, I'm Keith.
An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast. Before the break, we were talking some about the context from the Study Bible for this reading from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. So let's go ahead and look at a little bit of commentary. We've looked at the Study Bible, so we'll look at a little bit of commentary for this text, and it comes to us today from Lois Malcolm. Lois is the professor of systematic theology at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. So, systematic theology, that wasn't one of my favorite classes, but it's very important because it really walks you through all the different types of theology there are, all the different theories that there are about how the Gospels are written, how the theology is formed, because there's all kinds of different schools of theology, but we're not going to go there. Okay, so she says that this short, cryptic passage presents us with a synopsis of what life in Jesus the Messiah looks like. Even though, she says, it is part of Paul's long apology or personal defense, depending on how you look at it, for his apostolic ministry against some detractors, it applies to the rest of us since Paul's basis for defending himself is rooted in God's promises, which are always and for everyone. What it depicts with vivid imagery is a brief phenomenology. Ooh, that's a good word. In parentheses, she says a study of a phenomenon, so a phenomenology, of what being united with the death and life of Jesus the Messiah means for how we experience ourselves and others around us. So proclaiming the Messiah as Lord and ourselves as your slaves. Slaves, that's never a comfortable word. This passage begins with what could be described as its thesis statement. In the Messiah, what we announce or commend when we present ourselves to others is not our personal or collective egos. It's not our achievements. It's not what makes us special or important, or even the disclosure of some idiosyncratic personal or communal truth, regardless of how authentic any of this might be. No, that's not what we are. That's not what it is. She says, rather what we announce is that the Messiah is Lord. And that announcement, if sincere, binds us to being slaves for others, of others for Jesus' sake. And we've heard this before, right? That we are servants to all. We are servants to one another because Christ was a servant to us. He came and he was not the type of Messiah that people expected. He came and he ate with people, he healed people, he taught and preached, and he worked, he was always in relationship, right? No matter what he was doing, he was in relationship. He was a servant to all. And we are called to be the same thing. So, whether you think of it as being a slave or a servant, it's not putting yourself above those around you, but rather humbling yourselves and being a servant, with the understanding, though, that everyone else who is declaring Christ as the Messiah and the Messiah as Lord is doing the same thing. So everyone is working for the betterment of the community. Everyone is helping one another. It's not just me saying, oh my gosh, now I'm a servant to all, and everybody taking advantage of me, although that can happen. It's everyone doing that. So the source of this announcement, she says, lies in God's speaking creation into being. Let light shine out of darkness. And this light reverberates in the coming of the Messiah, right? And we see that a lot. We see that at the beginning of John's Gospel. We talk about that a lot in Advent. It shines in our hearts as well, giving us knowledge of the glory of God in the face or the personal presence of Jesus, the Messiah, in our lives. And then she moves to talk about this treasure in clay jars. We have this treasure, this personal presence of Jesus, only in clay jars, cheap and fragile earthenware. A metaphor for the vulnerability, she says, of our mortal existence. Earthenware vessels were also used in the priestly service of the temple, so they can be easily broken or contaminated. And she says you can look at Leviticus for more information on this. So why link this treasure with such inexpensive and easily broken vessels? So that it can be clear that this excess, this hyperbole of power comes from God and not from us. And Paul was very clear about that in a lot of his letters, right? He was always saying, I am writing this, but my power or my words don't come from me. My power doesn't come from me. I am doing all of this as my ministry. So Paul does not depict these extreme hardships that he talks about in this section in order to highlight his own strength amid diversity. No, and he will later, she says, parody such displays of prowess in this letter. He does not present them as an ideal of suffering to follow. Instead, his point is to stress that God's shining through us occurs precisely as we rely solely on God's promises of justice and mercy in spite of what may happen to us. And then she concludes the section on dying and living in Jesus. And we have talked about this before. We are alive in Christ, but we die together with Christ. She says, who do we become as a result of all this? What marks our inexpressible core as individuals? And what now defines our identities over time? What identifies us as selves in spite of what happens to us? Paul's response is stark. Who we become is now defined solely by carrying Jesus' death around in our bodies. That's pretty dark, isn't it? Only in this way can Jesus' life be manifest in those bodies. And what defines our identity over time is nothing other than being continually given up to death for Jesus' sake and the reign of the God he embodied. Only in this way is Jesus' life manifest amid the exigencies of our finite flesh. So in other words, we no longer live to preserve our identities, whether individual or collective. She says, dying in Jesus, we now live solely for the one who died for all so that all might live. And this is now what defines our inexpressible core as individuals. This now is what defines us, identifies us as selves in spite of what happens to us. So not so much what happens to you to create your core identity, but that identity is grounded in Christ's death and resurrection. So what Paul seems to be getting at, she says, is this. As all that distorts and spoils our created goodness dies in Jesus, whether we have created that dysfunction or others have imposed it on us, she says Jesus' life is manifest as the flourishing of new creation in our lives. She says flourishing and renewal also entails sharing in the sufferings of Jesus, continually being put to death by all that goes against what this crucified Messiah embodied. In fact, it is precisely as we share in Jesus' life and sufferings that the light of glory shines. The light of God's glory shines amid our fragile human existence. This is how death in us becomes life-giving for others. So we continually die to those things in our lives that go against our relationship with God. It can seem a little, like I said, dark. It can seem a little dreary and depressing, giving up ourselves to death. But this is one of those. This is why this is written, I'm sure, by a systematic theologian, because they love to try to explain these complex ideas. And I am not a systematic theologian. I will just put that out there. But we have been given such an amazing and incredible gift in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And I've said this before, that we have been loved so much by God, who sent Jesus to us so that we may have this eternal relationship with God, that our response is simply and only to love one another. And so that's where then this servant idea comes in. If we love one another, we take care of each other. We become a servant to one another. I am a servant to you. You are a servant to me. It's not just one of us taking on that role. It is loving God, or loving each other as God has loved us, as Jesus has loved us. And so we are still individuals. We are still ourselves. It's just that our experiences don't define us. Our identity as children of God is what defines us. We are still unique individuals. God created us as unique individuals, giving us skills and things that make us unique, but it's not our experiences that define us. It is our experiences. Obviously, our experiences are going to have an effect on our lives, and our lives are made up of experiences. But when it comes right down to us, the core of our being is not defined by those experiences. The core of our being is defined by our identity as children of God, by the fact that Christ died for us. And so in joining in that death of Christ, we die to everything around us every day that would turn us away from God, that would turn us away from our relationship with God. We have to die to that every day in order to maintain that identity as children of God. We don't ever lose that identity, but we have to make that conscious effort to turn away from anything that goes against our relationship with God, right? We are faced every day with decisions and choices that, well, I can do this. It might be the easy thing, or it might make me happy, but does it make my neighbor happy? Is it good for other people? Is it expressing God's love for them? So maybe that's oversimplified, but hopefully it helps to explain a little bit of what this passage is talking about. We are going to take a break, so stay tuned. When we come back, we'll be talking about the gospel assigned for this week. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, where we are speaking today about the texts assigned for June 3rd, for the week of June 3rd, which is the second Sunday after Pentecost. We have covered everything so far for this week, but the Gospel, which we're going to look at now. And we are currently in year B in the lectionary cycle, which puts us in the Gospel of Mark. Been doing if you go to a lectionary-based church, you'll notice that there was a lot of readings from John during the Easter season, but we are back to Mark now. And this week our reading comes from Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. And those verses are as follows. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. and he gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And Jesus said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against Jesus, how to destroy him. Again, that's Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. And it's one of those passages where everyone around Jesus, not his disciples, but in this case the Pharisees, are studying him, are watching his every move, trying to find something with which they can accuse him. We all know these people. We all know the people who are just waiting for us to screw up so they can report it, right? And this is what it feels like with the Pharisees in this passage. First of all, so Jesus and his disciples are walking through grain fields. And so I wonder, why are there Pharisees out there who can see them? I just picture like the Pharisees lurking around after Jesus, following him everywhere, like a really bad melodramatic villain in a comedy or something, kind of skulking about, watching him through the stalks of grain, trying to wait and see. Because really, why else? Jesus and his disciples, we don't know where they're going necessarily, but they're walking through some grain fields, and there just happen to be Pharisees there when the disciples start plucking heads of grain. So they do. And the Pharisees flip out. "Oh my gosh, look what they're doing. It's not lawful on the Sabbath. They are plucking grains. Stop it." Yep, Pharisees. Lurkers. They're lurking. They're watching Jesus' every move. They are trying to accuse him. And then even in the next section, when Jesus enters the synagogue, there's a man with a withered hand, and you can just see them the Pharisees twirling their villain mustaches, saying, "Aha, ha, 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 here's where we're going to catch him. He's going to heal this guy on the Sabbath, and then we'll have him." You can understand why Jesus is frustrated. I'm frustrated and I'm not even there. I mean, come on, stop following me. First of all, do you not have anything else to do? Do you not have anything better to do but wait for me to screw up, or what you perceive to be me screwing up? So yes, we have two scenes of controversy, one in the synagogue, one in the grain fields. But according to our commentary for the week from Matt Skinner, who's professor of New Testament, also at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, these two controversy scenes are very important, he says, for understanding the Gospel of Mark as a whole, which is interesting. He says they illuminate why some of Jesus' contemporaries found him offensive to such a degree that they would eventually deem him a grave danger. When explored on this first Sunday of the lectionary's return to Mark, he says, the scenes play a crucial role in setting the stage for many of the things that we are going to read between now and November, because we are going to be reading through a lot of the Gospel of Mark. So he says these two scenes are very important, and they play this crucial role. So we gotta pay attention to what's going on here, so we can carry that information with us forward as we continue reading through the Gospel of Mark. So he says the theologigical convictions that run through Jesus' controversies with Pharisees are difficult for some to trace, given that so many Christians default, he says, to defective notions of first century Judaism and unhelpful caricatures of Jesus' outlook on the law. So he says it's a good thing to explain some of this passage's nuances, just in case we have some misconceptions or incorrect ways of picturing what's really happening here. So the story begins with Jesus' disciples literally making a way through fields. They are not stealing grain as they journey. What concerns the Pharisees instead is the fact that they are traveling and gleaning on the Sabbath. Now, if you've heard of gleaning, that it was a practice. After harvest, some of the harvest was deliberately left behind for those who were poor, who didn't have income or source of food to come through and glean. And if you've read the book of Esther, then you know that plays an important role in that book. So the travelers are gleaning. They're doing this on the Sabbath. They're not stealing. What they're doing is fine, except that it's occurring on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees, according to the Pharisees, the disciples should have stayed put and prepared their snacks on the previous day. To the Pharisees, this behavior appears to be to deliberately neglect the mandate to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. Jesus, though, disagrees, not because he regards the Sabbath commandments as trivial, but because he sees a larger picture, one that regards the Sabbath in a different light. He, of course, then turns to another piece of scripture and a story about David to interpret scripture, the purpose of the Sabbath. He roughly, but not precisely, according to the commentary, summarizes 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. If you want to read that story about David taking consecrated bread that was supposed to be preserved for the priests, he says, see also Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 9. So David insisted on the bread because he was a fugitive seeking allies and fleeing Saul, who had clearly declared his intentions to kill him. Jesus implies that the priest, whom either Mark or Jesus misidentifies as Abiathar instead of Ahimelech, so Jesus implies that the priest, whatever his name was, did nothing wrong in breaking the strict letter of the law concerning the bread. By remedying David's hunger, the priest sustained the life of a weary traveler and contributed to David's quest to live into his calling as the anointed king to replace Saul. So Jesus therefore offers a legal opinion, one he derives from Scripture itself. He contends that sometimes certain demands of the law are rightly set aside in favor of pursuing greater values or meeting greater needs, especially when those greater needs promote a person's well-being and facilitate the arrival of divine blessings. If you notice, whenever this comes up, whenever in any of the Gospels, when it comes up about doing something on the Sabbath that someone else sees as unlawful, Jesus always looks to that bigger picture. Jesus always looks, is this contributing to someone's well-being? Is this contributing to making someone's life better? And this is a slightly abrupt interruption, but we do have to take one final break of the podcast. So when we come back, talking more about making someone's life better, talking more about Jesus' role in terms of the law and our role in relationship to that law. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I will be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and let's go ahead and jump right back into what we were talking about before the break, which is Jesus looking at the law, at not only the letter of the law, but the meaning behind the law, what it means to live in accordance with that law, and still love our neighbors. Jesus came, as he said, not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law and to give us a different way of seeing it. It's like we were talking about with 2 Corinthians. Because of what Jesus does for us, Jesus really was a servant to all, and we are asked to be servants to each other rather than abiding by such a strict set of rules that we can't see our brothers and sisters as humans who have needs. So he continues his commentary by saying it must be noted that Jesus' argument was hardly novel and therefore not scandalous on its surface. In fact, when he notes that the purpose of the Sabbath has always been to serve humankind, he's essentially restating Deuteronomy 5:12-15, in which God institutes the Sabbath, so a people who once toiled in slavery can forever enjoy at least a modicum of rest. And you remember we did read that if you listen to Sunday's episode. Rabbinic traditions dating to a century after Jesus, if not earlier, expressed opinions similar to his words, including the Sabbath is handed over to you, not you to it, and profane one Sabbath for a person's sake so that he may keep many Sabbaths. So the proper function of the Sabbath is to promote life and extol God as liberator. He says everybody knew that. Whether we knew it or not, everybody, he said, in Jesus' time knew that. The Pharisees understood the Sabbath. Perhaps they didn't appreciate that it was Jesus, by some appearances a new and uppity teacher, who was dispensing legal insights. Where Jesus definitely would have caught their attention was in his assumption that somehow he and his calling were comparable to David and David's calling. So they're not fully understanding who Jesus is at this point. Also, declaring himself the Lord or Master of the Sabbath itself could be tantamount to claiming that the law's ultimate purpose is to serve Jesus. So the scandal resides here. Jesus presents himself as no ordinary teacher. And you have to remember that we have the advantage of hindsight. We know that Jesus is the Messiah. People then didn't necessarily. Some people knew it, some people saw it, but the majority of people didn't see it, didn't believe it. And even if they wanted to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, he wasn't acting like they thought the Messiah should act. So now we get to the scene in the synagogue, which intensifies the conflict over Jesus' authority. So again, we have the Pharisees lying in wait, twirling their mustaches. And so for the Pharisees, it's not, the issue isn't whether Jesus has the power to heal the man's hand. It's whether doing so on the Sabbath demonstrates a willful disregard for the law of God, a law that was believed to give good order to life and to provide conditions for encountering God's blessings and holiness. Jesus isn't disregarding that. Jesus isn't, trying to do away with the Sabbath. He's not just saying, you and your Sabbath beliefs, no, we're not doing that. No, but listen to that. A law that was believed to give good order to life and provide conditions for encountering God's blessing and holiness. If you adhere strictly to just what the Sabbath says, don't do any work, don't do this, don't do that, you might miss those opportunities to encounter God's blessings and holiness. So Jesus' response to the Pharisees, he says, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? And so this indicates that Jesus disagrees with the premise of the suspicions of the Pharisees. By orchestrating the man's healing, he does not disparage or break the law in any way. For nothing Jesus does here can be considered work that the Sabbath prohibits. Rather, Mark casts Jesus as honoring the purpose of the Sabbath commandment. It's as if Jesus is saying that the chief objective of the law in general is to save and preserve life. So, indeed, therefore, what better day is there than the Sabbath, a day meant to promote God's commitment to humanity's well-being for the restoration of a man's malformed hand? So, again, and he says, admittedly, the man wasn't dying, but his hand was withered, and we don't know, was it his right hand, was it his left hand? Regardless, try to imagine going about your business and trying to, scratch out a living in the world, and it was a very hard world, with only one working hand, especially if it's your dominant hand, which we don't know. So Jesus gives the man, he allows the man to recover his ability to provide for his family. because, he is part of a family, whether it's anyway, he's part of a bigger community, and he's able then to provide for them. So as he said at the beginning, this is going to give us some insight into Mark for the months to come. And he says this is the way toward the cross in Mark. In this pair of scenes, he says, Jesus does not assail Judaism. He does not reject the law. He does not render the Sabbath obsolete. He does not even call the Pharisees blind or a pack of doters. So that's not what he's doing, and we shouldn't look at this passage like that either. Instead, we should look at the way in which disagreement about living within the law quickly escalates into hostility, a hostility that will lead some, certainly not all, of the most powerful religious authorities to seek Jesus' death. So even as this passage emphasizes a commitment to life and vitality at the heart of God's reign, it also illustrates how religious commitments and values, any religious commitments and values, can ossify and turn oppressive in the hands of careless stewards. None are immune. He says, in many ways, the entire Gospel of Mark tells a story of recurring controversy. Passages like this one help us to interpret the controversies and also eventually the events at the end of the narrative. So, such insensitivity and brokenness move Jesus to grief in the synagogue when he considers the stony, Pharaoh-like hearts that regard something as more valuable than removing suffering and disadvantage before the sun sets. But Mark also has good news to announce. This story of the inbreaking of reign of God will also tell of compassion and transformation. Jesus, like the God who instituted the Sabbath, is committed to preserving life. His ministry will expose the oppressive and corrosive tyrannies of fear, imperial pretense, and religious hypocrisy wherever they reside. But finally, he says, he will deliver us from them, from those things. So these are some things to keep in mind as we move forward into the Gospel of Mark, through the Gospel of Mark. Jesus didn't come to abolish the law. It may seem at times like he is, just doing away with so many things that people held sacred, but he's really not. He's trying to get people to pay attention. Pay attention to what is going on around you. Yes, you are adhering to the strict sense of the law, but is that doing any good? You may feel a sense of accomplishment because you are adhering to that letter of the law, but what good does that adherence do if the person sitting next to you is suffering and unable to care for their family? Would God just sit around and be like, okay, yep, you're doing what I told you to do. Just go ahead and ignore that suffering next to you? No. Jesus comes as the light in our darkness, but also to shine a light on a lot of the darkness of the world, to make us realize that the law is important. It helps us to live in community with each other, but only if it's helping us to live in community with each other and with God. When we adhere to the rules so tightly, when we hold on to those rules so tightly that we can't see the needs of our neighbors around us, then it does us no good. So these are some things to keep in mind as we go forward through the Gospel of Mark over the next few months. We're going to wrap things up here. I hope you'll join me again on Sunday as we start next week's readings for the third Sunday after Pentecost. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and I hope that you remember that you are a beautiful and beloved child of God. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.